This cabin doesn't suit people with your poor frequency. Pack up your things and get out of here. Those were the morning greetings Margaret Thornfield, our HOA president, had for me while I was touching up the paint on the wooden cabin I'd built with my own 2 hands. She immediately called the cops and accused me of threatening her with AMR-3 patrol cars rolled up like I was holding hostages. I didn't argue, I just silently placed something on the table, something the HOA should have read carefully, before deciding to mess with me. From demanding my eviction, Margaret quietly stepped back and the officer just nodded softly, avoiding my ease. Everything flipped in less than 3 minutes. So, what made everything turn around like that? Let me tell you the Hapa family story. This revenge tale will shock you. Let me tell you a Booth morning that completely changed my life. The sun was just beginning to peek through the towering pines of Pinewood Estates as I dipped my brush into the paint can for what felt like the 100th time that morning. It was 6 a.m. Andy was already 3 hours into touching up the exterior of my cabin. The same cabin I'd spent 2 years building from scratch. The morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine needles and fresh paint. And for a moment, everything felt perfect in my little corner of the world. I held my father's old hammer in my left hand, the weight of it familiar and comforting, like holding a piece of his memory. This wasn't just any tool. It was the last hammer my dad had, who said when he finished designing the original Pinewood Estates project back in 1987. Every morning when I picked it up, we could almost hear his voice telling me, "Son, a house isn't as important as the heart of the person who builds it." Today that voice felt especially close, though I had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. I was carefully painting around the window frame when I heard the sharp click of designer heels and gravel. Margaret Thornfield emerged from the tree line like some kind of suburban redditor, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair gleaming in the early morning light, and her lips pursed in that familiar expression of disapproval she reserved for anyone she deemed beneath her social status. At 52, Margaret had perfected the art of looking down on people, even when they were standing on the same level ground. She wore a crisp white blazer over dark slacks, the kind of outfit that screamed, "I'm important and you're not," and carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never been truly challenged in her life. Her eyes swept over my work clothes, my paint-stained hands, and the modest cabin behind me with the kind of disdain usually reserved for something you'd scrape off your shoe. "This cabin doesn't suit people with your poor frequency," she announced, her voice dripping with kind of entitled superiority that makes your skin crawl. "Pack up your things and get out of here." I stopped painting and turned to face her fully. Still holding my father's hammer, the morning light caught the tool's worn wooden handle, and I felt a strange calm wash over me. The kind of peace that comes when you know you're exactly where you're supposed to be. "Good morning to you, too, Margaret," I replied evenly, setting down my paintbrush but keeping the hammer in my hand. "I'm not sure what you mean by poor frequency, but I have every legal right to be here." Margaret's eyes narrowed as she pulled out her phone, her manicured fingers already dialing what I assumed was 911. "Legal right? You're nothing but a handyman who got lucky renting this place cheap while your luck just ran out. This is a respectable community and we don't need your type bringing down property values." The way she said "your type" made it clear she wasn't just talking about my profession. She was talking about class, about who belonged in her perfect little kingdom and who didn't. What Margaret didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment for 2 years, watching her abuse of power, documenting her harassment of families who didn't meet her arbitrary standards of worthiness. As she spoke into her phone, her voice took on the dramatic flair of someone auditioning for a soap opera. "Yes, 9/11s. I need police immediately at 47 Pinridge Drive in Pinewood Estates. There's a violent man threatening me with a hammer. He's approximately 6 feet tall, wearing workload, and he's been acting erratically all morning." I couldn't help but smile at the pure theater of it all. Margaret caught my expression and apparently decided it was evidence of my mental instability. "Yes, he's smiling at him now in a very threatening manner. Please hurry. I'm afraid for my safety." She ended the call with a satisfied smirk, clearly believing she just played her winning card. "The police will be here in minutes, and when they see you threatening a defenseless woman with that weapon, you'll be the one packing your bags straight to a jail cell." The hammer in my hand suddenly felt heavier, not with the weight of metal and wood, but with the weight of memory and purpose. I looked down at it, remembering the last time I'd seen my father use this very tool, putting the finishing touches on what he'd hoped would be a community where everyone could find their place regardless of their bank account. "You know, Margaret," I said, pulling out my phone and starting to record, "I want to document everything that happens next for posterity." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Document away. The only thing you'll be documenting is your own arrest for trespassing and assault." That's when I heard the distant wail of sirens growing closer by the second. Instead of panic, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 2 years of watching Margaret's reign of terror. Genuine excitement. The moment I'd been waiting for was finally here. "Actually, Margaret, before the police arrive, I think I should go inside and get something. Something that might change your perspective on this entire situation." Her expression shifted slightly, confidence wavering for just a fraction of a second. What could you possibly have that would matter? Some fake lease agreement, a sober story about hard times. I was already walking toward my cabin door. My father's hammer struck my hand when I turned back to her. Oh, it's much more interesting than that. See, there's something about this place, about Pinewood Estates, that you really should have researched before you decided to come after me. The sirens were getting louder now, and I could see the first patrol car turning onto Pine Ridge Drive, followed by two more. Margaret straightened her blazer and prepared to play the victim, but I was no longer paying attention to her performance. I was thinking about Thwaites box sitting on my kitchen table, the one I'd been saving for exactly this moment. The box contained more than just papers and documents. It held the truth about Pinewood Estates, about who really belonged here, and who had been playing a very dangerous game with other people's lives. As I reached for my door handle, I called back to Margaret, who was now practicing her distressed victim pose for the approaching officers. I'll be right back with something that will end this conversation once and for all. I think you're going to find the next few minutes very educational. The first parlor's car was pulling into my driveway as I stepped inside my cabin, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with the sweet anticipation of justice finally being served. Margaret Thornfield was about to learn that some people aren't as powerless as they appear, and some hammers carry more weight than she could ever imagine. The first patrol car pulled into my driveway with Officer Rick Martinez behind the wheel, a young guy in his late 20s with the kind of careful eyes that told me he'd learned not to jump to conclusions. The second and third cars followed in quick, their red and blue lights painting my quiet neighborhood in alternating colors that would have been beautiful if the circumstances weren't so ridiculous. Margaret immediately shifted into full victim mode, pressing her hand to her chest like she was having heart palpitations and pointing dramatically at my cabin door where he just disappeared. "Thank God you're here, officers. That man has been threatening me with a hammer since dawn." I was gesturing to explain community standards to him, and he became violent and erratic. Officer Martinez stepped out of his car slowly, his hand resting casually on his radio, but not on his weapon, which told me he was already reading the situation differently than Margaret had hoped. Behind him emerged Officer Stevens and Officer Chen, both looking around at the peaceful morning scene and probably wondering why they needed 3 cars for what appeared to be a neighborly dispute. Mrs. Chen from next door had come out onto her porch when she heard the sirens, and I could see her shaking her head in disgust as Margaret concluded her performance. "Officers, I've lived here for 8 years, and Margaret Thornfield has been harassing Gavarian in this community. Just last week, she threatened to have me evicted if I didn't vote for her in the whole election." Margaret whirled around, her face flushing red. "That's a lie. Mrs. Chen is just upset because I had to cite her for her garden gnomes violating our aesthetic guidelines." Mrs. Chen crossed her arms and glared. "My garden gnomes? You mean the 2 small decorative pieces my late husband gave me? The ones that have been there for 5 years without complaint until you decided they were somehow offensive?" Officer Martinez held up his hand to quiet the brewing argument and walked toward my cabin door. "Sir, could you come back outside, please? We'd like to talk to you about what happened here this morning." I opened the door and stepped back onto my porch, no longer carrying the hammer, but now holding a wooden mahogany box that had been sitting on my kitchen table, waiting for exactly this moment. "I'm sorry for the confusion, officers," I said, setting the box down carefully on my porch table. "I was just doing some routine maintenance on my cabin when Mrs. Thornfield approached me with some concerns about my presence here." Margaret scoffed loudly. "Concerns?" I was informing him that his lease has been terminated. "This is a respectable community and we have standards. He's clearly been squatting here, probably paying below market rent to some absentee landlord who doesn't care about maintaining property values." Officer Martinez looked between Margaret and me, then down at the wooden box. "Sir, do you have documentation showing your right to be on this property?" That's when Margaret smiled triumphantly, clearly believing she'd won. "Of course, he doesn't have proper documentation. Look at him. He's obviously just a handyman who found some cheap rental and thought he could get away with living above his means." I couldn't help but smile back at her, which seemed to irritate her even more. "Actually, Officer Martinez, I didn't rent this cabin." Margaret's smile widened. "See, he admits it. He's been trespassing on HOA property. Arrest him immediately." But Officer Martinez was studying my face carefully. He dealt with enough domestic disputes to know when someone was telling the truth and when someone was performing for an audience. "Sir, if you don't rent it, then what's your relationship to this property?" I placed my hand on the wooden box, feeling the smooth surface that my father had carved with his initials 38 years ago. "Well, officers, that's a bit of a story. You see, this cabin, like every other cabin in Pinewood Estates, sits on land that belongs to me. I own it." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear a woodpecker working on a tree somewhere in the distance. Margaret's mouth fell open, then snapped shut, then opened again like a fish gasping for air. That's impossible. The HOA's managed this community for 15 years. We have legal authority here." Mrs. Chen started laughing from her porch, a sound of pure delight. "Oh, this is rich. Margaret, You've been throwing your weight around on someone else's land this whole time. Officer Martinez stepped closer to the box. Sir, do you have documentation to support that claim? I nodded and began to open the mahogany box, revealing its contents layer by layer. The first thing visible was a photograph of my father and May 1. I was 12 years old, standing in front of the original architectural plans for Pinewood Estates. Officer Martinez examined the photo, then looked up at me with growing understanding. Is this your father? I nodded, my throat suddenly tight with emotion. Richard Happer, the architect who designed this entire community. He passed away last year and left everything to me. Margaret was backing away slowly now, her confident demeanor cracking like ice in spring. This has to be some kind of fraud. I demand you verify those documents. The HOA has been operating her legally for 15 years. Officer Martinez was still studying the contents of the box when Mr. Rodriguez appeared from across the street, walking over with purpose. Excuse me, officers, but I couldn't help overhearing. Margaret Thornfield forced my family to sell our cabin 2 years ago, claiming the HOA had the right to seize it for violations. She said we had no legal recourse. Margaret pointed at Jaime menacingly. You were behind on your HOA dues. You violated multiple community standards. Mr. Rodriguez shook his head sadly. We were never behind on anything. You just decided we didn't belong here. Officer Martinez looked from the photograph to me, then back to Margaret, who was now noticeably pale and had stopped her theatrical gesturing. He nodded slightly and avoided making direct eye contact with me, as if he was beginning to understand that he'd walked into something much bigger than a simple noise complaint. Ma'am, these appear to be legitimate documents. I think we need to reassess the situation here. Margaret's voice rose to a near shriek. Reassess? I'm the victim here. He threatened me with a weapon. I demand you arrest him immediately. But her words were falling on increasingly deaf ears. As more neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion and perhaps sensing that something significant was happening, I could see the doubt creeping into Margaret's eyes for the first time. The slow realization that the game she'd been playing for 15 years might finally be coming to an end. Officer Martinez was examining the second document in the box when I spoke, my voice calm but carrying just a hint of the storm that was coming. Officers, what you're looking at is just a beginning. Mrs. Thornfield has been operating under some very serious misconceptions about who has authority in this community, and I think it's time we cleared those up once and for all. The mahogany box sat on my porch table like a time capsule waiting to reveal its secrets, and I could feel the weight of 15 years of lies pressing down on this moment. Officer Martinez stepped closer as I lifted the lid, revealing the careful organization my father had maintained throughout his career. The first layer contained that photograph of us together, but underneath were documents that would reshape everything. Margaret thought she knew about Pinewood Estates. This is my father's memorial box, I said softly, my voice carrying the emotion I'd been holding back for months. Richard Happer wasn't just an architect, officers. He was the man who designed, planned, and developed every inch of this community from 1985 to 1987. Margaret's face had gone from flushed red to pale white, and I could see her mind racing as she tried to process what this might mean for her 15-year reign of terror. I carefully lifted out the second layer of documents, my hands trembling slightly as I held up my father's last will, officially notarized and bearing the seal of the county probate court. When my father passed away 13 months ago, he left me everything, including 100% ownership of 127 acres that make up Pinewood Estates. Officer Martinez examined through all carefully, while Margaret stood frozen like a statue, her mouth opening and closing without sound. According to Tothas's document, sir, you inherited not just the land, but all structures built upon it, including the 47 cabins currently occupied by residents. I nodded, feeling my father's presence stronger than it had been since his funeral. Every single cabin in this community, including the one Margaret lives in, sits on my land. The silence stretched so long, I could hear the morning birds calling to each other from the pine trees, completely oblivious to the human drama unfolding below their branches. Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. This has to be fake. The HOA has been managing this community for 15 years. We have legal authority here. Officer Martinez was now examining the original architect, and I could see recognition dawning in his eyes as he matched the blueprints to the community around us. These documents appear to be legitimate. The signatures, seals, and dates all check out. Margaret's whisper became a shout. But we've been operating legally. The HOA was established by the original residents. We have bylaws. We have authority. I reached into the box again and pulled out a folder thick with correspondence, legal notices, and documentation that I'd been collecting for 2 years. Margaret, the HOA, was never granted legal authority over this land. My father allowed the early residents to form a community organization for social purposes, but had never signed over management rights or property authority. Mrs. Chen started clapping slowly from her porch, and the sound echoed off the cabin walls like a mockery of Margaret's crumbling world. You mean to tell me, Mrs. Chen called out, that Margaret has been throwing her weight around on land that doesn't belong to the HOA at all? Officer Martinez nodded grimly as he continued reviewing the documents. It appears that way, ma'am. If these documents are authentic, and they certainly appear to be, then the HOA has been operating without legal authority over their property. Margaret was backing away from the porch now, her designer heels clicking nervously on the gravel as the full implications of the situation began to sink in. You don't understand. We've been protecting property values, maintaining community standards, collecting fees for improvements and maintenance. I pulled out a leather-bound ledger that I'd been keeping meticulously for the past 2 years, documenting every interaction, every fee collection, every threat Margaret had made to families who dared to question her authority. Speaking of fees, Margaret, let's talk about the $1.2 million. The HOA has collected over 15 years from residents for the privilege of living on land they already had permission to occupy. Officer Martins looked up sharply from the documents. Did you say $12 million? I nodded, opening the ledger to show him the careful calculations I'd made, cross-referencing HOA financial records with resident payments and alleged community improvements. Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward, his face grim with pain. Administrative costs, like when you told my family we owed $8,000 in back fees and fines. Evict I would never miss a payment. Margaret pointed at him accusingly, but her finger was shaking now. Your family violated multiple community standards. The flower boxes, the children's toys in the yard, the extra car parked in your driveway. Officer Martinez was taking notes now, and I could see the professional law enforcement officer emerging as he began to understand the escapade of what had been happening in Pinewood Estates. Sir, do you have records of these alleged violations and fees? I reached deeper into the box and pulled out a manila envelope thick with photographs, letters, and documented complaints that I'd been collecting since I'd moved back to my father's community. Officer Martinez looked from Margaret to me, then back to the documents spread across my porch table, and I could see him beginning to understand that this morning's call about a threatening man with a hammer had turned into something much more serious and complex. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back while we sort this out. And sir, I have to ask, do you have any more documentation in that box? I smiled for the first time since this whole confrontation began, feeling my father's spirit encouraging me to finish what he'd started when he designed this community as a place where everyone could belong. Officer Martinez, what he'd shown you so far is just the foundation. The real story, the one that's going to change everything at Butho Pinewood Estates operates, is still in this box. Margaret had stopped backing away and was now staring at the box like it contained a bomb that was about to explode. What do you mean, the real story? I looked directly at her, seeing the fear in her eyes for the first time since I'd known her, and felt a satisfaction that had been building for 2 years finally beginning to surface. Margaret, do you remember what you did to the Rodriguez family? Because I remember, and more importantly, I have proof. The mention of the Rodriguez family hit Margaret like a physical blow, and I watched as whatever remaining color drained from her face. Officer Martinez had stopped taking casual notes, and was now writing with the focused intensity of someone building an official case file. Mr. Rodriguez, you mentioned owing $8,000 in fees. Can you elaborate on that situation? The older man stepped closer to the porch, his weathered hands clenched into fists at his sides. My family lived here peacefully for 12 years until Margaret decided we didn't fit her vision of the community. She started writing us up for we didn't exist, claiming our garden was too ethnic, our children were too loud, our car was too old. Margaret's voice cracked as she tried to interrupt. That's not how it happened. There were legitimate complaints from other residents, but Mrs. Chen shook her head from her porch. Margaret, I live right next to the Rodriguez family. Their children were angels and their garden was beautiful. You drove them out because you're a bigot. I opened the manila envelope and spread out a series of photographs showing the Rodriguez family's modest but well-maintained property, alongside copies of the harassment letters Margaret had sent them over 6 months. Officer Martinez, these photos, to show the Rodriguez property before Margaret campaigns against them. That's, you can see. Everything was neat, clean and well within any reasonable community standards. I handed him the letters, watching his expression grow darker as he read. Margaret's increasingly threatening language. Notice how the violations became more frequent and more serious over time. Despite no actual changes to their property, the final letter threatened legal action and property seizure if they didn't pay $8,000 in accumulated fines and fees. Margaret was shaking her head frantically. They were behind on their HOA dues. They violated multiple community standards. I was just doing my job as HOA president. Mr. Rodriguez's voice was steady but filled with pain. We were never behind on anything, Margaret. You made up those violations, Bess. You wanted us gone. Officer Martinez looked up from the letters with a grim expression. These letters appear to show a pattern of escalating harassment based on subjective violations. Mr. Rodriguez, what happened after you received the final demand for $8,000? The older man's shoulders sagged with remembered defeat. We couldn't afford a lawyer to fight it. Margaret said if we didn't pay within 30 days, the HOA would seize our cabin through a lien process. We had to sell to avoid losing everything. I reached back into the box and pulled out a thick folder labeled Property Transactions 200-2025 that I'd been compiling for 2 years. Officer, here's where it gets interesting. The Rodriguez family sold their cabin for $180,000 to avoid the threatened seizure. Margaret purchased it 3 weeks later for $195,000 through a shell company called Pinewood Properties LLC. Margaret's eyes went wide with panic. That's a coin, said and say I didn't know who was buying their cabin. I opened the folder and showed Officer Martinez the incorporation documents for Pinewood Properties LLC. Margaret Thornfield is listed as the sole owner and operator of company, which she registered 2 months before she started harassing the road. The pieces were falling into place, and I could see Officer Martinez beginning to understand the scope of Margaret's operation. So, you're saying Mrs. Thornfield forced this family to sell their home under duress, then purchased it herself at below market value? I nodded, pulling out more documentation. That's exactly what happened, but the Rodriguez family wasn't her only target. I spread out a chart I'd created, showing 12 different families who had been driven from Pinewood Estates over the past 5 years through similar harassment campaigns. Each of these families was targeted with manufactured violations, threatened with seizure, and ultimately forced to sell. In every case, properties were purchased either there by Margaret directly or through one of her shell companies. Margaret was backing away faster now, her designer heels catching on the gravel as she stumbled slightly. This is all speculation, coincidences. You can't prove I did anything wrong. Officer Martinez was studying the chart with the intensity of a detective working a major. Sir, do you have documentation supporting these claims for all 12 families? I had spent 2 years preparing for this moment, and my documentation was thorough. Officer, I have copies of every harassment letter, every manufactured violation, every threatening communication Margaret sent to these families. I also have third-party transfer records showing the below-market sales and subsequent purchases by Margaret's companies. Mrs. Chen called out from her porch, her voice filled with righteous anger. She tried the same thing with us last year. Started writing us up for our garden gnomes, said they violated the aesthetic guidelines. When I refused to remove them, she threatened to fine us $500 per month until we complied. Officer Martinez looked back at Margaret, who was now visibly trembling. Ma'am, is it true that you've been using your position as HOA president to force residents to sell their properties? Margaret's voice came out as a despaired whisper. I was protecting property values. Someone had to maintain standards in this community. These people didn't understand what was required to live here. I felt my father's hammer in my memory. The weight of his dreams for this community, and the anger that had been building for 2 years, finally found its voice. Margaret, my father designed Pinewood Estates as a place where working families could afford to live in a beautiful setting. You turned it into your empire, driving out anyone who didn't meet your arbitrary standards of worthiness. Officer Martinez was now calling for backup, speaking quietly into his radio about potential fraud and harassment charges. Margaret heard him and her panic reached a new level. You can't arrest me. I'm a respected member of this community. I've been HOA president for 8 years. I reached into the box one more time and pulled out a bank statement that would shatter what remained of Margaret's world. Officer Martinez speaking, of Margaret's respect in the community. I think you should see where all that HOA money went. Margaret's face went ashen as she realized what I was about to reveal. Don't you dare. That's private financial information. But it was too late. The truth about Margaret's embezzlement was about to come to light, and there would have no going back. The bank statement I pulled from the box wasn't just any financial document. It was a smoking gun that would expose the true scope of Margaret's criminal enterprise. Officer Martinez leaned forward as I spread the papers across the porch table, and even from her retreating position, Margaret's eyes were locked on the documents, like a deer caught in headlights. This is a statement from First National Bank showing deposits into Margaret's account from Pinewood Properties LLC totaling $38 million over the past 5 years. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Margaret's sharp intake of breath, and Mrs. Chen's whispered, "Holy Mother of God," from her porch. Officer Martinez studied the numbers carefully, his pen moving a ferocious notepad as he calculated the implications. Sir, are you saying Mrs. Thornfield has been depositing money from property sales into her accounts? I nodded, pointing to specific line items that told the story of Margaret's systematic exploitation. Every cabin she forced families to sell was purchased through her shell company, then either resold at market value or rented out for profit, with all proceeds going directly to her accounts. Margaret's voice came out as a strangled cry of desperation. That money was for community improvements, administrative costs, legal fees. But I was ready for that, pulling out a second set of documents that would destroy her last line of retreat. Officer Martinez, the actual HOA financial records that Margaret filed with the state, showing total community expenditures of $180,005 over 5 years for legitimate maintenance and improvements. The math was devastating. Margaret had collected $1.2 million in fees from residents, stolen $38 million from forced property sales, yet spent only $180,000 on actual community needs. That means Margaret personally pocketed nearly $5 million while claiming to serve this community. Officer Martinez was now writing furiously, and I could see backup units beginning to arrive as word spread through the police department about the scope of this case. Margaret was shaking her head frantically, her carefully constructed facade crumbling completely. You don't understand the complexities of community management. There were expenses you can't see. But her protests were falling on deaf ears because Mr. Rodriguez had found his voice again, and 15 years of suppressed anger were finally breaking free. Expenses like the $8,000 you demanded from my family for violations that didn't exist, like the legal threats you made to force us out of our home. Mrs. Chen joined in from her porch, her voice carrying across the morning air with righteous fury. Or like the $500 monthly fines you threatened me with 4 garden gnomes that violated your mad-up aesthetic guidelines. I could see other neighbors beginning to emerge from their cabins, drawn by the commotion and perhaps sensing that something historic was happening in their community. Margaret looked around at the growing crowd of faces, many of whom she had bullied or threatened over the years, and I could see the realization dawning that her reign of terror was finally coming to an end. Officer Martinez finished a call on his radio and turned back to us with a grim expression. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remain here while we sort this out. We have financial crimes investigators on their way." The mention of financial crimes investigators seemed to break something inside Margaret, and she suddenly lunged a word, the porch table, trying to grab the bank statements and other documents. "You can't have those. That's private property. I demand you return my personal financial information." Officer Martinez stepped between Margaret and the table, his hand moving instinctively toward his handcuffs. "Ma'am, you need to step back and remain calm. Visa documents appear to be evidence in a potential criminal investigation." But Margaret was beyond rational thought. No, her desperation making her reckless. "Criminal investigation? I am the victim here. This man has been stalking me, harassing me, threatening me with weapons." I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of her claims. Given everything that had been revealed in the past hour, "Margaret, the only weapon I've been carrying is the truth, and that's more dangerous to you than any hammer could ever be." That's when I decided it was time to reveal the final piece of evidence that would end Margaret's criminal enterprise once and for all. I reached deep into the mahogany box and pulled out a DVD case labeled HOA Harassment Evidence, $2,020,225 in my careful handwriting. "Officer Martinez, what I'm about to show you will prove that Margaret's operation wasn't just about money. It was about systematic intimidation and harassment of families she deemed unworthy of living in Pinewood Estates." Margaret's eyes went wide with terror as she stared at the DVD case. "What is that? What did you do?" I held the case up so everyone could see it. "For the past 2 years, I've been documenting every interaction, every threat, every harassment campaign Margaret has conducted against the residents of this community." Mrs. Chen started clapping again, and this time several other neighbors joined. "In your court, you recorded the Iron Fist in action." Officer Martinez looked from the DVD to Margaret, who was now backing away again but had nowhere left to run. "Sir, what exactly is on that recording?" I felt my father's presence stronger than ever as I prepared to play the final card in a game that had been 2 years in the making. "Officer, this DVD contains video and audio evidence of Margaret threatening 12 different families with property seizure, using racial and economic slurs, and explicitly stating her intention to drive certain residents out of the community through manufactured violations and harassment." Margaret's face had gone completely white, and she was shaking so badly that I thought she might collapse. "You secretly recorded private conversations. That's illegal. That's entrapment." But Officer Martinez was shaking his head as he examined the DVD case. "Ma'am, if these recordings were made in public spaces or during official HOA business, they would likely be admissible as evidence." I could see Margaret's world collapsing around her as she realized that all her years of bullying and had been carefully documented. "Officer Martinez, would you like me to show you the most damning piece of evidence? The recording where Margaret explicitly outlines her plan to force out what she calls undesirablements from Pinewood Estates." Margaret let out a sound that was part sob, part scream. "You can't do this to me. I built this community. I made it what it is." It looked at her with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. "Margaret, you're right. You did make this community what it that became a place where people lived in fear of your arbitrary judgment. But that ends today. This was the moment I had been building toward for 2 years. The climax that would bring Margaret's reign of terror its final devastating end." Officer Martinez held the DVD case in his hands like he was holding evidence that could topple the government. And the growing crowd of neighbors sensed that they were about to witness something that would change Pinewood Estates forever. "Officer, before I play this recording, I want you to understand that what you're about to hear represents the systematic destruction of families and the perversion of everything my father hoped this community could become." Margaret was hyperventilating, Now, her hands pressed against her chest as she struggled to breathe. You can't play that, it's taken out of context. Private conversions aren't meant to be public. But Mrs. Chen shouted from her porch with a voice full of righteous anger. Private, you threatened my family in broad daylight in front of half the neighborhood. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the scene as I prepared to destroy Margaret's world completely. I slid the DVD into my laptop and turned the screen toward Officer Martinez, knowing that the next few minutes would deliver the justice that had been 15 years in the making. The first video clip began with Margaret standing in front of the Rodriguez family's cabin, her voice clear and unmistakably cruel as she addressed Mrs. Rodriguez and her 12 young children. This community has standards, Maria, standards that your family clearly doesn't understand or respect. Your flower boxes are too ethnic, your children are too loud, and frankly your presence here is bringing down property values for everyone else. Mrs. Rodriguez's voice was barely audible as she tried to defend her family. Mrs. Thornfield, we follow all the HOA rules. Our children play quietly and our garden is beautiful. Margaret's response was like a slap across the face. Beautiful. That gaudy display of colors and those tacky Virgin Mary statues. This isn't Mexico, Maria. If you can't adapt to American communities, perhaps you should find somewhere more suitable to your cultural preferences. Officer Martinez's jaw clenched as he watched Margaret's racist tirade continue, and I could see Mr. Rodriguez behind him, wiping tears from his eyes as he relived the humiliation his family had endured. The video showed Margaret's escalating threats over several encounters, each one more vicious than the last, until she finally delivered the ultimatum that would drive Rodriguez's family from their home. I'm giving you 30 days to pay $8,000 in accumulated fines and fees, or the HOA will begin seizure proceedings against your property. Margaret's recorded voice continued with cold satisfaction. And then think about getting some Mexican lawyer to fight this, because I have connections throughout the county legal system that will make your life a living hell. The recording captured Mrs. Rodriguez breaking down in tears while her children watched in confusion, not understanding why this angry woman was making their mother cry. Officer Martinez paused the video and looked at Margaret with disgust. Ma'am, did you threaten this family with racial harassment and abuse of legal process? Margaret was sobbing now, her carefully constructed image shattered beyond repair. I was protecting the community, property, values, standards, but her protest sounded pathetic against the evidence of her recorded cruelty. I advanced to the next video clip, which showed Margaret confronting an elderly black veteran named James Washington about his garden. These vegetables don't belong in a respectable community, James. This looks like a farm, not a superband neighborhood. Either you remove this eyesore or I'll cite you for agricultural violations. The pattern continued through video after video, each one showing Margaret systematically targeting families based on race, ethnicity, economic status, or simply her dislike of their lifestyle choices. She threatened the Chen family over gnomes, harassed the Martinez family for speaking Spanish in their yard, and demanded that the Johnson family remove their children's basketball hoop because urban sports equipment didn't fit the community aesthetic. Each recording was more damning than the last, building a case for harassment, discrimination, and abuse of power that would destroy any sympathy Margaret might have claimed. Officer Martinez called for additional backup as the scope of Margaret's crimes became clear and I could see financial crimes. Investigators pulling into the driveway behind the patrol cars. Margaret seemed to realize that her world was collapsing completely because she suddenly lunged toward my laptop screaming, "Turn it off, turn it off. You're destroying everything I built." Officer Martinez caught her arm gently but firmly guided her away from the computer. "Ma'am, you need to remain calm while we complete our investigation." But Margaret was beyond calm, beyond rational thought, beyond anything except pure panic, as she watched 15 years of carefully constructed authority crumble in real time. You don't understand what I sacrificed for this community. I made hard decisions. I maintained standards no one else would. I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I thought about my father's original vision for Pinewood Estates, and how completely Margaret had corrupted it. Margaret, my father designed this place so that working families, immigrant families, military families, all kinds of families could have a beautiful place to call home. You turned it into your kingdom where you could play judge and jury over who deserved to belong. The irony wasn't lost on me that everything was changing in less than 3 minutes. Just as I had promised in my opening statement, Margaret went from demanding my eviction to facing arrest. From holding absolute power to having none at all. From buying Queen of Pinewood Estates to being exposed as nothing more than a racist bully who had hidden behind fake authority for 15 years. Officer Martinez was reading Margaret her rights as financial crimes. Investigators began evidence from my porch table, and the growing crowd of neighbors watched in stunned silence as their longtime tormentor was finally brought to justice. Margaret's last words before being placed in the patrol car were a desperate plea that revealed the depth of her delusion. "This is all a mistake. I'm the victim here. I protected this community from people who didn't belong." But her words fell on deaf ears because everyone present had seen the evidence, heard the recordings, and witnessed the complete exposure of her criminal enterprise. As the patrol car pulled away with Margaret sobbing in the back seat, I felt my father's presence one last time, and I could almost hear him saying that justice had finally been served. The empire Margaret had built on fear, racism, and greed had fallen completely, and Pinewood Estates was finally free to become what it was always meant to be. 2 weeks after Margaret's arrest, I stood in the exact spot where my father had once surveyed his dream project, watching 47 familiars go to for the first annual Pinewood Estates community barbecue. The contrast couldn't have been more striking. Wherein there had been fear and division, now there was laughter and genuine neighborly connection. Margaret had been charged with 12 counts of fraud, embezzlement, harassment, and civil rights violations, facing a potential sentence of 15 years in federal prison. The local news had picked up the story, dubbing it the HOA takedown, and suddenly Pinewood Estates had become a symbol of what happens when communities stand up to bullying and corruption. I carried my father's hammer with me that day, not as a tool of work, but as a reminder of the man who had dreamed of this moment, when people of all backgrounds could truly call this place home. Mrs. Chen approached me with appetite of homemade dumplings, and a smile that could have powered the entire community. "Jake, I can't thank you enough for what you've done. For the first time in 15 years, I feel like I belong here." Their transformation had been swift and dramatic once Margaret's criminal enterprise collapsed. Within days of her arrest, I had officially dissolved the HOA and announced that Pinewood Estates would transition to a cooperative housing community where residents would have genuine input into decisions that affected their lives. The $4.80 million that Margaret had stolen was being recovered through asset forfeit, and every family she had driven away was being invited back with an offer they couldn't refuse: lifetime residency for $1 per year. The Rodriguez family had been among the first to return, and watching their children play freely in the yard that Margaret had also declared to ethnic filled me with a satisfaction that went beyond personal revenge. Officer Martinez had been promoted to detective, partly based on his handling of the Pinewood case, and he'd made a point of stopping by the barbecue to see how the community was healing. "You know, Jake, in 15 years of police work, I've never seen a case that felt more like real justice being served. Margaret got exactly what she deserved. But the story was bigger than just one corrupt HOA president and one small community in the mountains. Within a week of Margaret's arrest, I had received calls from 47 different communities across 3 states, all dealing with similar problems of HOA abuse and corruption. The local news coverage had sparked a national conversation about the lack of oversight and accountability in homeowners associations, and suddenly I found myself at the center of a movement I never expected to lead. I decided to establish the Richard Happer Foundation for Community Justice, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping residents fight back against abusive HOAs and corrupt community management. The foundation would provide legal resources, documentation assistance, and, most importantly, hope to families who thought they had no recourse against the Margaret Thornfields of the world. Mrs. Chen had volunteered to serve as the foundation's first community outreach coordinator. Mr. Rodriguez was working with us to develop educational materials about residents' rights. The barbecue was serving as our unofficial launch event, and the response had been overwhelming. Detective Martinez pulled me aside as the afternoon wound down, his expression serious but hopeful. "Jake, I've been thinking about our conversation. Regarding the foundation, I've decided to take early retirement from the force and join your organization as head of security and investigation." The offer surprised and delighted me because Martinez had proven himself to be exactly the kind of principled, community-focused person the foundation needed to succeed. "We're going to need someone with your skills and integrity to help other communities document abuse and build cases against corrupt officials. Are you sure you want to leave law enforcement?" He nodded firmly, looking around at the families enjoying their first taste of real community freedom. "This is law enforcement, Jake. This is what protecting and serving looks like." His decision to join us meant that the foundation would have credibility with law enforcement agencies across the country, making it easier to get corrupt HOA officials prosecuted rather than just censured. As the sun began to set over Pinewood Estates, I gathered the community together for a ceremony I had been planning since the day Margaret was arrested. We unveiled a memorial plaque dedicated to my father, Richard Happer, with an inscription that captured his vision for what communities could be. Richard Happer Memorial Community, where everyone belongs, regardless of background, income, or heritage. But the real unveiling was what came next, a permanent monument that would ensure Margaret's crimes were never forgotten or repeated. Next to my father's memorial, we installed a second plaque titled The Pinewood Promise, which outlined the community's commitment to equality, justice, and mutual respect. Every new resident would be required to read and acknowledge this promise, ensuring that future generations would understand the price of allowing prejudice and corruption to take root in their community. The Rodriguez children helped me pull away the covering cloth, and the crowd erupted in applause that echoed off the mountains. surrounding our little valley. Mrs. Chen asked me to say a few words to the gathered families, and I found myself struggling with emotions that had been building for 2 years. My father designed Pinewood Estates because he believed that beautiful places shouldn't be reserved only for wealthy people. He wanted working families, immigrant families, military families, all kinds of families to have access to the American dream of home ownership in a supportive community. I paused, looking around at faces that represented exactly the diversity my father had envisioned. Margaret Thornfield tried to turn that dream into a nightmare of division and fear, but she forgot some board communities aren't built on exclusion and hatred. They're built on inclusion and hope. The applause was but what moved me most was seeing Mr. Rodriguez wiping tears from his eyes as his children played freely in the yard that had once been denied to them. As the evening ended and families began heading back to their cabins, I sat on my porch with my father's hammer across my lap, feeling his presence stronger than ever. The final surprise of the day came in the form of a phone call from 60 Minutes, requesting an interview about the man who brought down an HOA empire with nothing but patience and a wooden box. I agreed to the interview on one condition: that they also feature the Rodriguez family and other victims of Margaret's harassment, ensuring that their stories of resilience and courage would be part of the national conversation. As I hung up the phone, I realized that what had started as a simple desire to protect my father's legacy had grown into something much larger. This movement could help communities across America reclaim their democratic values from the petty tyrants who had hijacked them. Margaret Thornfield was facing 15 years in prison, but more importantly, her victims were finally free to live without fear. From a simple cabin and a carpenter's hammer, we had rebuilt not just a community, but hope itself. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe. Alex Stories.